Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for day 2 of our 2021 Digital Stratosphere Conference. Hopefully you were able to join yesterday and are excited to continue our great content and breakout sessions today. I'm Kyler Sheedham. If you didn't meet me yesterday, I am the marketing manager here at Third Stage and your host today. So just a few housekeeping things before we get started, just to go over a few logistics. As we mentioned yesterday, we do want this conference to be incredibly interactive, so please feel free to put your questions in the chat or the Ask a Question section at the bottom of the menu bar on the right-hand side. You will see there's a schedule button at the top left-hand corner under the Digital Stratosphere menu. That is for tomorrow's breakout sessions when we do have multiple sessions going at one time. So you're good to just stay here today as we are doing keynotes for today. The schedule today is looking like it's packed full. Again, we're going to start with our founder and CEO, Eric, who I'll pass it to in just a second here. But we'll also do some planning, managing, and leading your transformation. So more granular tactics from Stuart Robb, our VP of Europe. And then business process management and how to incorporate excellence or best practices into that. We will have a panel discussion from some of our operations experts here at Third Stage, Brian Lakaruba and Dave Beldick, moderated by Adam Cheatham. And then a lot of you were here and excited for our change management strategy and programming, which Nate will now actually go into how do you build a change plan and more tactical approaches there. And then cybersecurity, obviously a hot topic in the industry today. We have our security expert, Daryl Crockett, and then also Marcus Harris from yesterday to make sure that when we are in that contracting phase, we are able to evaluate any red flags when it comes to our data. And then we will end today with a panel discussion led by a lot of our senior managers here. And they'll actually bring true client lessons learned that they have seen in working on these projects. So very excited to get started today. I am going to post some questions just here in the chat box to make sure everybody's doing okay with breaks and logistics while Eric is chatting today. But with that, I will turn it over to our CEO and founder, Eric. As many of you know, he is a main and top thought leader in the digital transformation industry. He's an ERP expert and just overall our leader here at Third Stage. So with that, he will take us through kind of how do we make sure that we're defining our transformation strategies for the 2020s. Welcome, Eric.
All right. Thanks, Kyler. And thanks, everyone, for being here on day 2 of Stratosphere. Excited to not only walk through this session here with you, but for the other sessions as well. I always tell people that I love these events because of how much I learn. Every time I hear one of the speakers, even if it's one I've seen before, I've seen the exact topic before, I always learn quite a bit from hearing the other speakers. So I hope you find the same here as we go through today's session. I guess just to get started, what might help just to maybe wake up the room a little bit, at least for those of you in the US that we're still a bit early, and also just to get a better sense or a better pulse of where some of you are in your transformation journeys. If you wouldn't mind, just put in the chat, where are you in your process? Are you just starting a transformation? Are you in the middle of one? Have you finished one? Are you not? Maybe you're not in the middle of one. You're just here to learn. If you wouldn't mind, just maybe give me a little bit of a sense in the chat box of what phase you're in and where you're at in the whole journey, just so I can try to tailor this as we go and sort of hone in on certain points that might be more relevant to the audience here. And that'll be very helpful. So far, I see a couple of you saying you're at the beginning of the process. So I think this will be particularly relevant to you. And even if you're in the middle of it or just looking to learn, I think there's always some good takeaways that can come away from this. So what I want to do today, as I'm pulling up my slides here, is I want to talk about this whole concept of digital strategy. How do we define a strategy? How do we define a roadmap that makes the most sense to us as an organization? And how do we define one that is aligned with our overall goals and objectives as an organization? So just looking here, it looks like most of you are somewhere in the early stages, either planning or procurement, just getting started. One of you said that your back end stopped, front end ongoing. So I don't know if that means you have CRM systems or other customer facing systems that are still ongoing and you've already finished with the financials. So it sounds like either way, Marco, you're in the middle of it in some capacity, but you have certain work streams that are still ongoing. So we'll try to tailor this and make sure we cover not just the front end stuff, but what do you do ongoing and how do you manage to this whole strategy and roadmap as we define it. So this is a presentation. Actually, you know what? I apologize. I pulled up the wrong presentation. So bear with me. I'm going to keep talking while I bring up the right one. And just for those of you that don't know, I am not a morning person. So anytime I'm the first person to present it, so there's always a risk that something like this will happen. So let me stop sharing for a moment, and we'll pull this right back up as we.
Yeah, and Eric, as you're doing that, folks, if you have any feedback on our format yesterday when it comes to breaks time or content that you'd like to see, if it was absolutely perfect and you love the format, we'd love to know that too. Just wanted to check in to make sure everyone's comfortable as we go into today. So as we do that, if you want to pop any feedback in the chat box, we can kind of just make sure that we're hitting all expectations and everybody's feeling good to start today.
Oh, okay. I see what happened. Actually, you know what? I have the right presentation, but I have the wrong title on it. So good news, bad news, I suppose. So you can ignore this title here. This is actually not executive summary of transformation best practices. Actually, this was a test to see how many of you were paying attention. How many of you realized that I just gave this presentation yesterday? No one caught me yet, but I'm sure you're all thinking it. So this is not executive summary of transformation best practices. This is about digital strategy. So apologies for my own confusion there. So when we think about the overall digital strategy and what it is we're trying to accomplish as an organization with our transformation, it's important to think about this whole concept of alignment. And I know this is something that I talked quite a bit about yesterday. I heard Marcus and a couple others mention the concept of alignment. It's a pretty vague, sort of a nebulous term, but really when we think about misalignment and the dynamics of what often happens with organizations going through their implementations or their transformations, is they experience some sort of a disconnect between what they're trying to accomplish as an organization strategically and what's actually happening boots on the ground with the transformation itself. And I think I mentioned a couple examples yesterday of how that manifests itself in a project, and maybe just to walk through that again, just to give you some context, and maybe some of you can relate to this. And I'd love to hear your chat comments if you've had any experience related to what I'm describing here, or if you have other related experience related to misalignment. Now, a lot of times, let's start on the surface. When we think about misalignment, a lot of times people will think, well, we're aligned as an organization because our executive team is totally on board with this project. They approved it. They're on board with the budget. They're on board with putting in new technology. They're on board with using technology out of the box, minimizing customization. And on the surface, you talk through some of that stuff and it sounds like we're all aligned. We're all on the same page. We're all marching in the same direction. And, we may call it good at that point. So you can sort of move down to the mid-level management and then ultimately the frontline end users to make sure they're all aligned too. And I'll get to that in a second. But before I get to the frontline people and the mid-level management, even just at the executive level, what ends up happening is we haven't fully articulated typically when we go through this process. Typically the executives and the project team, the transformation project team, have not fully articulated what exactly this transformation is, what it means, how it's defined for us as an organization. And we have to go a level deeper than what I just described as far as, no customization, for example, or we want a single ERP system for our entire enterprise, or we want to create a common operating model. Those are all great. Those are all great grand ambitions, but they're very vague, and it doesn't really give us a lot of direction when we're going to define our transformation and define our project. And so what ends up happening is you take that very vague high-level strategy, and then you get down to the digital transformation team, the project team, and then ultimately the end users and all the stakeholders and people that are affected by the project. And there's not only a disconnect, but there's a lack of clarity on what exactly this means. And oftentimes those high-level ambitions are so vague and unattainable in many ways, or they're not 100% attainable, I should say, that the project team ends up making decisions that they think is best, but ultimately they're shooting in the dark and they end up sort of going off path or veering in a different direction. So just to give you an example, let's take that, that common operating model concept. Let's just say one of your executive stakeholders or your executive goals for this project is to create an operating model that's common and standardized across your organization. Well, that's great, but first of all, most organizations don't get there 100%. Usually it's not a blanket statement or a blanket ambition that applies equally to all your different functions and business processes. So inevitably you get into the project and you find that, okay, we can't have a fully synchronous 100% standardized operating model because there's something different about this organization or this part of the organization over here or over here. And so then you start having to make decisions around, well, how am I going to deal with that? How am I going to address that? Is it okay to address that? The fact that I'm getting a lot of pushback here at the local level at this part of the organization over here. And without that clear direction, it's shooting in the dark. And what's probably going to end up winning out in those arguments is the path of least resistance. And the path of least resistance is to go back and sort of pave the cow paths and implement technologies and processes that are more similar to where you are today versus what you could be in the future. So I'm trying to simplify or kind of break down at a summary level this long-term big strategic dynamic that oftentimes plays out in these transformations with just one example. But you take that one example of common operating model, there's dozens of other decisions and variables that have to be defined as part of your strategy so that you have clear direction and clarity of what this project is going to mean. And so that you don't leave your project team guessing as to what this transformation should entail. And when we look at the root causes of failure, so when we get hired to go in and do project recovery for a failed project, or if someone like Marcus or other attorneys hire us to be an expert witness, we often find that level of misalignment is a root cause of why the projects fail. And no matter how good your system integrator is, or how good your project team is, or how good your technology is, even how good your change management team is, you're not going to be able to overcome that level of misalignment if you haven't addressed that early on. So the whole idea here with the digital strategy and defining that strategy and roadmap for the future is to make sure that you have clarity and a clear vision and direction for what this project is going to entail for your organization. And that's what we'll talk about here today, is how do we overcome that misalignment? How do we get aligned? And how do we drive alignment strategically for our long-term roadmap? So you may recognize a slide that looks similar to this yesterday. I apologize, the yellow, the middle box is not sharing as well as it looks on my screen here. But the general gist of this from what we talked about yesterday is that, how do you reach that third stage of success is the big question here. And we want to have a good understanding of how to get there. And the whole idea is, how do we define a digital strategy and roadmap that helps us get to that third stage? And what we find is that most organizations don't get stuck in that first stage. So if you recall, the first stage is sort of that massive failure. Those are the projects that never really get off the ground. They were doomed from the beginning and they just, end up in a disaster. And a lot of times you read about it in the news or hear about it in the news if it's a larger or well-known organization. The reality is that most organizations don't struggle with that. I mean, most organizations are competent enough to get past that first stage, with the exception of, the Waste Managements or the Hershey's of the world, and some of the others that Marcus talked about yesterday. But the problem is you hear about them when they fail, especially when it's a big company. The bigger challenge and the bigger risk and the more common risk is the second stage, which is those are the sort of the moderate successes or the moderate failures, however you want to look at it. Those are the ones that, you got some technology up and running, you tweaked some business processes, you got some value, but you didn't get everything you expected or even a majority of what you expected out of the system. You took too long, you took more money than expected, it took more resources, it created more chaos. At the end of the day, everyone's still standing, but it was a lot more disruptive and painful than it needed to be. And then ultimately, you look at the third stage, which a minority of organizations ever reach that third stage, but that's really what we want to strive for when we're defining our digital strategy, is how do we create that long-term roadmap to get us there? And how do we avoid that pitfall that 80% or more of organizations get stuck in that second stage that are mentioned here? So I'm going to go through 10 steps. So there's really 10 key parts of defining a digital strategy. And it's sort of a semi-sequential sequence of events that you should really be going through to get from wherever you might be today, and assuming that your executives and your organization as a whole has a general clear direction of where they're going. And quite frankly, most organizations we work with, they sort of know, they know where they're headed. They know what their strategy is. They know what their strengths and weaknesses are. It's pretty rare that we have to get involved in some real, heavy hitting strategic overhauling of organizations. Usually they have, they're successful and they've grown, and, they figured out a way to navigate their industries and their competition and whatnot. But the bigger challenge is connecting the dots between that relatively clear corporate strategy with something as nebulous or as vague as a digital transformation. And that's what these 10 steps are intended to do, is to get us to that point to where we can take that high level strategy that's probably rattling around in everyone's heads within your organization, but we're formalizing it and we're translating it, articulating it in a way that's definitive for a digital strategy and for an overall digital roadmap, and ultimately a detailed project plan that's going to help us get there over however many years that it might take. So the first thing is articulating organizational strategy. So ensuring that we have a clear vision of what it is that we're trying to accomplish as an organization. And usually when we go in as consultants, it's usually just a matter of picking the brains of people that are, on the executive team and upper level management to understand what those big picture objectives are. But then the whole goal is not just to understand what those objectives are, but then to start to translate it down to the next level of details, to start asking questions and getting clarity and definition around the next level of detail below. And generally, we'll do this with a strategy articulation map, which is sort of a hierarchical, starting at the top with some high level strategies, which actually it's a bit hard to read, but the top left corner where it's numbered 1 is one of the first things we do, is that strategy articulation map, where at the top you have your strategy and objectives, your high level corporate strategies and objectives. And then you unpack below that, what are the goals and objectives of the transformation, and what are those decision points for the transformation in how they're going to enable or support those higher level goals and objectives. So, this is a sort of a first pass, or starting to dig below the surface of defining what those high level parameters are for the transformation. And as part of that, and as you look at that visual on the left side, as part of this whole articulation of organizational strategy, we then get into defining where on the spectrum your organization falls for a number of strategic decisions that need to be made as part of a transformation. So, for example, I use the example, which is a really big one, and it's important to most, if not all, organizations we work with, which is defining what level of standardization do we want to have within an organization, and what level of independence or flexibility do we want to have. So, and then obviously there's a continuum there. It's not a either or answer. It's usually a scale, on a scale of 1 to 10, where do we want to fall in terms of retaining flexibility and having optimal flexibility versus having optimal or maximum standardization and commonality and efficiency. And again, most organizations are somewhere in between. The other thing is that it's not just one answer for the entire organization. Usually we break that down by business unit. We could break it down by business processes within the business units to look at, for the finance organization in Latin America, this is what it looks like, which may look different than the finance organization in the US or in Europe. Maybe even a better example would be, anytime you have any sort of customer or service facing processes, so sales or customer service type processes, a lot of times those functions are more likely to remain a bit more flexible or a bit more localized. Whereas something like a finance, other than some of the regulatory finance stuff at the local level, finance, GL, accounting, AP, AR, that sort of stuff, a lot of times that's more apt to be standardized. So you have different answers for different processes, and you really want to have clarity and unpacking that with the executive team so that the executives are all on the same page with, yes, this is sort of the way the dials are in place for this transformation, so that then when we get down to the next layer, which is putting together the detailed project plan and ultimately selecting and implementing technology, we have a pretty clear roadmap. We have a pretty clear set of parameters, and we're not guessing. We're not shooting in the dark trying to translate day-to-day activities into some, vague grand ambition that doesn't make a lot of sense, at the tactical level. So that's just an example of how we articulate that organizational strategy and how that definition is so important early on. And ultimately what we do too, as part of this, which is very important, and it's not mentioned on the slide here, but generally we will not only define sort of where the variables lie for each part of the business and each of the decisions that need to be made for any given organization, but then we look at, well, what are the risks of that? So we just made all these decisions. We also want to look at what the trade-offs are. So we may have mitigated some risk by making decisions A, B, and C, but decisions A, B, and C have their own risks. And what are those risks and how are we going to mitigate them? So, for example, just sticking with that common operating model theme, if we say we're going to, standardize our finance function across the globe, the good news is it's going to drive common business processes. It's going to drive efficiency. It's going to drive better transparency and visibility into financial data. But what's the risk that we just created? And every decision like that, we may have addressed some other issues and pain points, but we've also created some risk inevitably and unintentionally, of course. So in that case, the risk is that that's going to be a pretty big change for our organization to move all of our finance groups to a common operating model. And certainly if we're moving to a shared service model, that's going to be an even bigger change. So there's risk there. What are we going to do to address that risk? And now we know that, by the way, when we talk about our change management strategy, we really need to hone in on that finance function because that's going to be a massive change for them. Other parts of the organization still need change management, but maybe finance ends up being the one that's going to be the most impacted and where we really want to invest most of our time from a change perspective. So that I'm just going through sort of a example scenario of how this stuff plays out in terms of defining a strategy, a transformation strategy for an organization. So that's the first step, is to articulate that organizational strategy, and not only articulate it, but unpack it and define it in detail that gives the transformation team enough understanding and direction on how the project's going to play out or how the project should play out to support the overall goals and objectives. And then the next step that we typically would go through is to assess the current business processes. So map out, at a high level, the current processes and where the big low-hanging fruit opportunities for improvement are. A lot of times, there's two sets of risks here or challenges that organizations face, and they're sort of opposite ends of the spectrum. One end of the spectrum is that organizations feel like they don't need to worry about their current processes because they want to forget about it. We don't like our current processes, so why are we going to talk about it? Let's just focus on getting new technology and put new technology in place. Okay, that may be true. I challenge that and say, well, there's got to be some stuff within your organization that's good that you want to retain and keep. Otherwise, you wouldn't be successful. You wouldn't be competitive in your industry, and you wouldn't be effective as an organization, even with technology that's outdated. So that's one risk, is that we tend to oversimplify and say that, well, let's not worry about current state. Let's focus on future state. And that's true. You don't want to get into too much detail, but you do need to understand where we're starting from, because that helps us, first of all, prioritize where the opportunities for improvement are. But from an organizational change perspective, it helps us connect the dots between where we are today and how that's going to change in the future. And it's really hard for change people to be effective if they don't do so in the context of where we're grounded today. Whether we like it or not, that is what it is. That's where we are, and that's what people understand. So how do we translate this and do this in a way that allows people to get to that level of where they need to be in the future? So that's one challenge on one extreme, is that organizations say, we don't need to worry about current state. We don't need to worry about processes. We're just going to start deploying technology, and that's going to drive the processes for us. Now, the other extreme, which is also risky and a challenge in and of itself, is that you do some process work up front, but you do too much of it. You end up overanalyzing every single nook and cranny of the organization, stuff that may be relevant in some cases, but in many cases it's not relevant because it is going to go away. So the way I tend to think about it is, if you sort of imagine high level business processes, super high level, and then down here you've got super detailed business processes, which are transactional, step by step, what screen you go to, what buttons you push, all that stuff. The stuff down at the bottom doesn't matter. You don't need to be overanalyzing and re-engineering that stuff yet, because you don't know what the technology is, and the technology is going to help you enable much of that. But you can start at the top and sort of work your way down. And once you bump up against sort of an imaginary line or a subjective line that is dependent on what technology you deploy, that's where you stop. You don't want to go past that line, because it's a moot point in many cases, and you're over analyzing at that point, and you're spinning your wheels because you don't know what the technology is going to be. So, and that's for the future state definition I'm talking about there. But even with your current state, when you're talking about current state, you don't want to spend a lot of time over analyzing, but you do want to have that general flow and understanding of how our processes work now, where the pain points are, not at the detailed transactional level, but just more at the general workflow level. So that then we can say, okay, here are the areas we want to improve, and then here's what the business case is to, the benefits we expect to get out of it, which I'll get to that here in a few minutes. So assessing current processes is a important next step. And then also assessing your current organization. So really understanding not just the step-by-step processes and the operations of the organization, but the organization itself, the human side of it. So what, in addition to processes, we want to look at what kind of skills we have, how are we organized in terms of reporting relationships, what are the roles and responsibilities, what are those potential impacts that we already know even at the early stages of a project. A lot of times we'll know and uncover big picture sorts of changes that we know are going to be significant to the organization or certain parts of the organization, and really defining what those future state needs are. Another important part of this too is really understanding the culture of the organization and where it is you are today and how you intend or want to bend the culture. You're not going to change it overnight. You're not going to take 100 years or however long you've been in business or existed as an organization. You're not going to take decades or more of, culture development, and you're not going to change it overnight in a year or two, as part of a transformation. But we can start deliberately bending the culture and shifting the needle in a certain direction. Just to give you an example, a lot of organizations we work with are high growth companies. They've, maybe they're family owned or maybe they're private equity owned. They've grown up from being say a $50 million organization up to hundreds of millions or sometimes in the billions. And in that transition, the culture hasn't kept up or hasn't evolved fast enough to enable, where they're headed in the breakneck speed they might be growing at. So, when they were a $50 million organization, as an example, that's a lot different type of culture. It's more of entrepreneurial, shooting from the hip. Flexibility is generally valued. But then when you become say $1 billion organization or bigger, you need a different culture, a different mindset. You can be somewhat entrepreneurial, but you need to start to add in doses of, efficiency and scale and things of that nature, and repeatability, predictability, in some cases, things that are considered bad words or maybe taboo in your organization, but you need to end up shifting in that direction oftentimes. So we have to think about, well, what's the culture today and what is it we need it to be more like in the future, and how can we start bending that culture, and what are some of the things we can be doing from a change perspective to start to bend the culture and move the needle that way. And that's another, by the way, this whole concept of culture and organizational alignment, that's a whole nother component or aspect of misalignment that I was alluding to before. Even if we've done those first two steps I've talked about so far, we have clear articulation of our strategy. We've defined and assessed our processes, but then our organization and where we're headed as the organization itself, if that's not aligned, then the first two steps are going to get severely undermined. So evaluating that organization is an important next step for certain. And then just sort of completing out the whole people, process, and technology trifecta here. We've covered people and process. Now you get to the technology. How do we assess those current systems and the current architecture? And this is looking at a few different angles. One is, what applications do you have in place? We have a client right now. It's a larger organization in the healthcare industry, and we're having a really difficult time with this client. Our team is having a really difficult time just getting a handle on what all the systems are that this organization has, just because they've grown through acquisition, they're multinational, and there's just all these, call it black market or, underground types of systems that have popped up over the years that no one person seems to be aware of. So we're, poking around, just trying to figure out what systems are here and what systems ultimately are we going to replace, and which ones ultimately might we want to keep or need to keep for regulatory or functionality sorts of reasons. And so assessing and understanding what those current systems are is important. Your overall infrastructure, even if you're going to move to a cloud environment, you need to understand sort of what is that infrastructure look like now? How might it look in the future? Or if for some reason you're going to retain some on-prem systems and maybe you're doing more of a hybrid where some stuff will be in the cloud, some will be on-prem, what does that architecture need to look like going forward? And then there's also another piece of this too, which is really important, is not just the physical systems and architecture, but also just the organizational infrastructure. So understanding what our IT department in particular, our IT and related technical support groups, if you have like a business systems group or whatever that might be outside of IT, but more at the functional level, anyone that's dealing with systems, you want to understand what those skills are and those competencies are that you have in-house. Because chances are, even if you're doing an upgrade, like we talked about yesterday, we talked about how moving from SAP ECC to S/4HANA as an example, that's a pretty big shift in terms of skill sets, competencies, technical proficiency, technical needs, all that stuff, because it's a whole new system. It's, even though it's SAP, it's a whole new system. It's a rewrite, new platform, new architecture, new database, all that stuff. And the same is true for Oracle and Microsoft and a lot of these other vendors that have been around for a long time with legacy systems. So you really need to understand what are the skills we have now and what are they going to be in the future. And that's especially true if you're making a pretty dramatic change, if you're moving from an old legacy system to some unrelated new vendor. That's an even bigger shift than if you're moving from a SAP S/4HANA or SAP ECC to S/4HANA. That's still a big shift, but not as big as if you're moving from some homegrown system to a modern ERP system. So we want to understand those skills and competencies, because chances are our IT department, our IT group, our IT competency itself is going to need to shift significantly. And it may be a matter of upskilling people. It may be a matter of bringing on new team members. It could be a matter of removing team members. It could be a matter of outsourcing certain things to third parties. Whatever it is, we need to figure out the lay of the land of where we are today and what the gap is with what we need in the future from a organizational and a physical infrastructure perspective. Stop me at any point with questions, and I'll obviously stop a few minutes early to capture any questions you have. But feel free to chime in at any point in the chat box. I've got an eye on it here, and Kyler will stop me as well if something comes up that's relevant. So the next thing, step 5 here, is to assess current performance measures. So we want to look at what measures you're using to drive the business right now, and that could be obviously something as simple as overall profitability and SG&A costs and high level P&L line items. That's certainly important, but what's even more important is to get down to that next level of operational detail. What sort of metrics are important to you as an organization, whether it be something like inventory turns, inventory accuracy, total time to close the books for period end close, what's the average lead time for customers, all that sort of stuff. You want to look at all these metrics and really understand, where are we performing well and where could we be performing better, and how could technology or process improvements or organizational improvements or all of the above, how could our transformation enable improvements in some of those areas and some of those performance measures. And again, it's all about doing two things here. One is to create a business case, not just for justification for the project. Although I'll say that most clients we work with really resist the idea of a business case for justification purposes, because there's so many organizations right now, and this problem's getting worse, the longer I'm in this industry and the more technology changes. And that problem is that organizations say, well, we don't need a business case because we have to change. Technology's moved this far ahead and we're still back here in the 80s, when we built our legacy system. So there's really no business case to talk about. We have to upgrade. Okay, well, that's probably true, or it may be true, but it's the other issue, or the bigger issue that a business case addresses, is that it gives you better clarity and governance around how the transformation is going to work. So when you look at something like, average inventory turns, if that's a pain point for you right now and you're sitting on too much inventory and you're trying to free up capital cost as a result, there's a benefit there. There's an estimated benefit that may or may not justify the project, but even if it doesn't justify the project, at the very least, what's even more important is that it gives us direction on the project to know that inventory turns is a big deal to us, and we've got to figure out a way to tackle inventory turns. And so then cast your mind forward to the middle of a transformation. Someone comes forward and says, hey, I want to customize the software. I don't like the way it works out of the box. And this will happen to you. If it hasn't happened already, it's going to happen to you at some point. So, consider this prep for that sort of change management issue that inevitably will happen at some point along the way. So someone comes forward and says, hey, I want to customize the software. And then you say, why? Or better yet, you might just say, no, we're not customizing. We already decided we're not doing any customization. Well, so you end up making arbitrary decisions without really having context or a business case of, well, why do you want to customize? Well, is it just because, or is it because it actually enables some of these performance metrics that we've defined as high priorities to the organization? And it may be that, let's just say, just to throw out random numbers, it's going to cost us $50,000 to change something in the system. It's going to introduce a certain amount of risk, but it's going to increase our ability to optimize inventory turns by whatever amount. In that case, maybe it's worth it. Maybe there's a positive ROI there, and we make an exception and say, okay, we will customize in this case, but only because we can tie it back to the business case, and only because there's a clear ROI on it. And that helps you differentiate between the legitimate customization request or changes to scope versus the, hey, we just don't want to change because we've always done it this way types of request. And without that business case, you're going to either assume that they're all signs of resistance and you're going to say no, or try to say no to everyone, or you're going to get steamrolled as a project team because, again, the path of least resistance is just to go ahead and customize because you don't want to deal with the politics or the personality conflicts of saying no. So that's just an example of how a clear set of performance measures can give you clear direction and governance on an overall project like that. And it also gives you clear direction on what your reporting capabilities and requirements are. So that's another important secondary benefit of defining your performance measures, is it gives you a head start to where you can make sure that during the transformation that you are creating the analytics and the visibility and the reporting in a way that supports what it is you're trying to accomplish, and it doesn't become an afterthought. Too often the whole reporting, analytics, data concept ends up becoming sort of a downstream, last minute, oh yeah, we need to get this done real quick before implementation sort of thing. Whereas this is an opportunity to pull it forward and say, no, we're going to be more strategic and more deliberate about this stuff and how we tackle it. And then what we do here is we then, after we've done all those first 5 steps, then we start to look at, well, what are our options? What are our viable alternatives to accomplish all the things that we just defined over however many weeks or months that we spend doing steps 1 through 5. And this is where you look at, again, not either or answers, but usually these are sort of continuum type of answers. It's not, do you want a new software? Yes or no. It's not even, do you want a single ERP? Yes or no. It's usually, do you want to lean more towards a single ERP system? You're probably not going to get all the way there, but do we want to lean that way? Or are we leaning more towards, say, a best of breed approach where we have sales and finance and warehouse management and other parts of the organization go out and find their own technologies, or we find the best technologies for each of those groups, and then we figure out a way to tie it all together? Chances are, most organizations are somewhere in the middle, but we need to figure out where, as an organization, we're leaning based on all the stuff we've done earlier in these first 5 steps. And, this is where the whole concept of silver bullets, this is a good anecdote to that, or antidote to the silver bullet myth. This is a way to say, this is who we are as an organization, and from a people, process, technology, and strategy perspective, and a performance measure perspective. Now, here are the options that best align with what it is we are and what we're trying to become. And it's not as simple as saying, well, if you ask SAP, or if you ask, NetSuite or Microsoft Dynamics or a VAR of one of theirs, if you ask them to define your roadmap or your strategy for you, it's obviously going to be very product centric, focused on how their product can do everything that you just defined in steps 1 through 5. Well, chances are they probably can't. So, let's be a little bit more agnostic about that and figure out what those decisions are, which will then lead us to the best options in the marketplace. And this is oftentimes a way that we'll use to get to either a short, long list or an overall short list of potential options or systems, is just based on some of these different parameters that we lay out. And no matter what direction we lay out, and at this point, we're looking at sort of high level strategic direction. So, for example, let's assume that our stated goal or our stated path, or one of our stated paths or options, is to implement a tier 1 ERP system. It could be SAP or Oracle, maybe Microsoft. We don't know yet, but that's the general path we're considering. So we want to look at, what does that option look like in general, without getting into software evaluation and selection yet, which we're going to cover that later today, I believe, or tomorrow, I think it is. But even before then, what sort of systems are we looking for? Are we looking for best of breed, tier 1 ERP, tier 2 industry focused solution, some sort of custom solution? whatever it may be. We want to have general direction, compare the total cost of ownership, do a sort of a cost benefit analysis of these different paths, and then assess these different paths in the context of how does that align with our overall strategy. And what ends up happening is a lot of times you won't even consider certain paths because they're not aligned with your strategy. And others you might narrow down to 2 or 3 different paths you could go down, and then you sort of narrow in or hone in on what those pros and cons and trade-offs are for those different alternatives. So that's that next step here, is to define what those viable alternatives are. What are the general sort of paths that we could take? And usually we'll try to put together, it seems like 3 is a good number for most organizations. I'm not sure why. It just seems like it's a good way to sort of narrow down to 3 most viable options. And it's a good way to compare them side by side, so you can pick one direction that makes the most sense for you as an organization. Or if it ends up being a hybrid, you can define a clear path forward among those 3. But generally, we'll lay out 3 scenarios. One might be, implement a global tier 1 ERP system. Another one might be, implement best of breed types of solutions at a localized level. And then, I don't know what the third one is, something different. So you have 3 different options or potential paths. You assess them, and you assess in the terms of alignment with the organizational goals and objectives, with the ability to improve business processes, the ability to deliver an ROI, and you compare those, and ultimately you pick a path forward based on those alternatives. And then once you look at each of those alternatives, you're also defining, usually once you've picked one of those paths, I should say, usually then we'd say, okay, we looked at these 3 different paths we could take. We're settling in or honing in on this one that seems to make the most sense for whatever reason or whatever reasons. And now if we were to go down that path, here's what that 3 to 5 year plan looks like. Here's what the cost benefit looks like. Here's what the ROI is. Here's what the overall risk profile is. Here's how we're going to mitigate those risks. And, this is the overall alignment with the organization. And some of that you inherently start to do in the assessment of the 3 paths forward, or the 3 options forward. But here you really dive a little bit deeper into it, to defining it in little more granularity in terms of how we're going to roll out the overall transformation. And then you also want to define a business case and benefits realization plan based on that specific path. So earlier we talked about general performance measures and sort of what are those metrics that are important to the business. You start to get into a little bit of what are some of the goals we want to achieve, or at least what are some of the improvements we want to make. But here, when we get to the business case, this is where we really start to define it in terms of dollars and cents. Those benefits that we talked about with performance measures, if we get on this path, these are the benefits we expect. This is the cost that we expect to see. And then this is the overall ROI. And, again, we don't know what software is yet. We haven't gotten RFPs or proposals typically at this point, or, maybe we have. I mean, everyone handles this a little bit different, or everyone's at different stages of their journey. So we do end up tweaking this based on client needs. But in a perfect world, you would do this before you start the procurement process and have a pretty clear vision at a high level, at least, of where, what some of those ROI components are. And what the overall benefits realization plan. And that's the other key part of this too, is it's not just a justification exercise here. This is also a way to define what the actual benefits are. And this goes back to Dave Beldick's presentation yesterday, and he's actually going to do another one tomorrow about benefits optimization, optimizing and getting your transformation on track. So sort of that post-implementation optimization approach, that becomes a lot easier when you have a business case up front. So I talked about how a business case can be a great project governance tool during the transformation to help you make decisions. But what's just as important, maybe even more important, is after implementation, now you have a benefits realization plan that you can manage to say, okay, spoiler alert, we didn't get all the benefits we expected on day one. And I wouldn't expect that anyone here on this call is going to on day one. But there's some benefits we are achieving, which is great. And there's a lot we're not. So let's hone in on the ones we're not. Why are we not hitting these? Why are we not performing to the level that we expect in all these different areas that we outlined in our business case? And let's get to the root cause of why that is. And I actually think this is if I had to pick one part of a project, or it's one of 2, I should say, it's one of 2 parts of a project that I enjoy the most. It's that benefits optimization, because it is so, I don't want to say it's easy, but compared to all the pain you just go through in a transformation, to now go optimize and really look at root causes of why are we not getting the performance we want out of the system, or out of the process, or out of the people, or all the above. That work is relatively light compared to all the heavy lifting that goes into the transformation itself. And the value is super high. So if you have to pick an area where you're going to get the most value, it's going to be in that benefits realization area. But the problem is, once you go live, everyone's sort of like, they're just done with it. They're ready to go back to their jobs. They declare victory or not. Either way, they sort of go back to their jobs and let it be. So if you can spend time optimizing and really fine tuning, that benefits realization plan is going to help you get a lot more value out of the transformation, so that ultimately you don't end up having to do this again anytime soon. I mean, that's ultimately the goal here, is to let's figure out something that gives us a really strong foundation that we don't have to go replace again anytime soon. We might constantly be tweaking and adapting and improving over time, but we don't want to have to build something that's sort of a, call it a second stage moderate failure. We want to have something that's a good success that gives us a really solid starting point for today. 2, 3, 4, 5 years from now, it might be that we have to keep upgrading and changing and improving, and that's okay. We don't have to go through this process again. And the better we handle benefits realization, the less likely that's to happen. And then you want to define your change management plan. So what are those components of change in the strategy that's going to best enable the transformation components that we've just talked about, or that you've articulated and defined in the first 8 steps? And we're going to have another session on organizational change that'll go into this in more detail with Nate later today. That's where we get into things like assessment, ownership, alignment, agility, all these sorts of things. And then there's also other tactics and tools that are used during the change process. But the idea here is we want to talk about at a high level, what is the change strategy, and what are those biggest picture changes and issues that we're going to have to manage as part of our change management program. Because ultimately, if there's, just a handful of maybe 2 or 3 things that most commonly delay a project, change management is one of them, or lack thereof. So if we don't move this change management stuff up front to our strategy phase, then chances are higher that change management is going to be the thing that delays our project, or lack of change management will be the thing that delays our project. So the better we can define this stuff early up front, the better off we're going to be. And then finally, leveraging independent outside help along the way. Companies like ours, like Third Stage, anyone that's fully technology agnostic, knows what they're doing, has been through this process before. Those are people that can very effectively help you through this process, because ultimately this whole exercise we just described is not, it's not intended at all to be a sales process. In other words, the intent of this should not be to justify why you should implement SAP or Oracle or NetSuite or whatever, Workday, Salesforce, whatever it may be. The idea here is to agnostically and objectively look at what are our needs from a business and organizational perspective, and from a technical, but from a agnostic technical perspective. And then what technologies are going to fit in that potentially. And then once we've done that, what are the risks? Because there's still going to be risks left. And let's not sugarcoat it. Let's not oversell this to our internal stakeholders. Let's look at where the pitfalls are that we're about to embark on, because that part is just as important as the decision itself, is to understand that this is the best decision for us. But guess what? There's still risks out there. There's landmines we're at risk of stepping on. So having that agnostic and independent advice, people that aren't afraid to share, what those risks are and how you're going to mitigate those risks, is very important. Because if we pretend they're not there, we are going to step on the landmines, and we see that all the time. Where, due to human behavior, like I talked about yesterday, sales tactics, whatever it may be, you end up glossing over those important details of what's under the surface and where those landmines. And we need to know that to be able to put together an effective strategy and roadmap. So that is what I had for the 10 steps to defining your overall digital strategy. It also obviously touches heavily on alignment, the whole concept of alignment as well. I'll stop there and see what questions you guys have.
Yeah, so Eric, it looks like Bob is asking for some additional description of symptoms of lack of readiness, or a workable strategy to address this. So can you dig into that a little bit more?
Sure. So I'd answer that in maybe 2 layers. On the surface, there's the layer of, when we're not ready as an organization, you'll start to hear rumblings from stakeholders and employees and executives of, why are we doing this? Or, why are we going to try this again? We failed doing this 5 years ago or 10 years ago or whatever. you get that sort of the more, I don't want to call it the intentional resistance that Nate was talking about yesterday, but I'd call it more on the surface sorts of resistance or organizational lack of readiness. But the even bigger symptoms are deeper than that. That's where you start to get into when we start to unpack change impacts, or when we start to define, even earlier, when we start to define what the business processes and what that business process blueprint is going to look like for the transformation going forward, you start to get a ton of resistance to that idea because it's so different potentially than the way we're doing things today. Or it's, there's some form of resistance there. And so what we want to do is really back to this whole sequence of events that we talked about here. The better we do these things, these 10 steps to get alignment from the top down to the mid-level management, down to frontline employees, the less likely it is that we're going to get resistance and we're going to run into readiness sorts of issues. It's not going to solve all the problems, but at least we've articulated and hopefully we've started to communicate to people, this is what our vision is for this project. This is what we want to accomplish. As part of this, back to that finance example, as part of this, we are going to standardize our finance function. Here's why, here's what it's doing for our organization. Here's what it means to you and how it's going to help you do your job better, whatever the case may be. That sort of stuff is a way of getting people ready for the change, even before we get to, end user training, or even before we get to testing or design of technology. That stuff should be starting sooner. So the symptoms are that people push back and resist, and they want, probably the biggest, most costly and risky symptom is when people start pushing back and saying, we want to change the software, we want to change the processes back to what it is today, or something more like it is today. It's probably the biggest one. And then the workable strategy, I'd say, is, everything we just talked about today. That's phase one, I guess I would say, or the foundation for getting to that readiness, because we can't really get the organization ready if we don't have this level of clarity that we've talked about here in this session. And that is a problem with change management practitioners. And it's not because change management practitioners don't know what they're doing. It's because they're walking into a situation where this stuff hasn't been defined yet, and they're trying to figure it out as they go so that they can help get the organization ready. And if you're bringing in outside consultants, or, even people internally on your team, and you haven't defined this level of alignment strategically, by definition, they're not going to be aligned either, and they're not going to have the answers, and they're going to be going off, track unintentionally. So the best way to address it is to do this stuff here up front that we talked about today, but also really unpack and dive into that organizational change strategy piece of it, and make sure that, we've defined a strategy that's tailored for you as an organization, that's specific to what your needs are and where the forms of resistance might be specific to you.